Welcome back to renowned physicist Dr. Jeremy England, former professor of physics at MIT, author of Every Life is on Fire, currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel. Welcome back, Dr. England.
Thank you very much. This evening, I would like to discuss a quite famous midrash, a homiletic story from the Talmudic sages about the life of Abraham, of Avraham Avinu, and think particularly about the comment that it's trying to make about how the Torah understands scientific reasoning about what's possible and how that may connect with the notion of divine providence or a sort of intervention in the events of the world by the will of a creator who makes judgments of people and orchestrates the sequence of occurrences and history in general to reflect that judgment. So I think many of us have heard in one form or another the story about how when Avraham was still living in Ur Kasdim, where he originated from, that he worked in the idol shop of his father, because his father was an idol maker. And there's sort of this version of the story where we remember the part where he smashes all of his father's idols, or maybe if we remember a little bit more, we remember he has this kind of cheeky thing he does where he puts a mallet or a stick or something in the hand of the biggest idol and blames the smashing of the idols on the big one. But that really is part of a whole lengthy midrash in Bereshit Rabbah, which connects actually more than one story that Avram is famous for, because the whole sequence of events, and it's lengthy, so I won't read the whole thing, begins with Avram's father leaving him to mind the shop, the idol shop. And then first, a 50-year-old man comes along and he asks for an idol. And Avram exclaims, woe that a 50-year-old man should want to worship something that was made yesterday, and sort of mocks him. So the fellow leaves. And then a woman comes along to take an interest in the idols, and she has a pan of flour that she wants to offer. And so Avram puts it between some idols and then makes out like the idols are fighting each other and smashes them and blames the biggest idol, and then tells his father that the biggest idol had smashed all the other ones because it wanted the pan of flour. And his father said that's ridiculous. And Avram sort of points out that in that case, idolatry is ridiculous, because if you don't believe the idol can do that, then why on earth would you bow to it? And all of this is supposed to culminate in Avram being handed over to Nimrod, the king of, depending on how we describe it, Bavel or Shinar or Ur Kasdim or what have you, but the sort of king of the East, that represents the idea of a despotic pagan god king of the ancient Near East. And Nimrod says, he gets in this whole disputation with Abraham about which element should be worshipped. And Avram sort of leads him around in a rhetorical circle, saying that, water can quench fire and the rain can hold, the clouds can hold water, et cetera, et cetera. And then Nimrod says, okay, so we'll just throw you in the fire. And that leads to this other famous event where Avram is thrown in the fire into Kivshan Ha'esh, the fiery furnace, by Nimrod, and miraculously he survives. And then there's another part, which is less often relayed, but is the completion of the Midrash, which is that Avram had a brother named Haran. And Haran, really this whole comment, this whole Midrash is a comment on the Pasuk saying about Haran that he died in the presence of his father Terach, which is an explicit statement in the Torah that's a little bit of extra detail, that Avram had these brothers, Haran and Nachor, and Haran died in the presence of his father Terach in Ur Kasdim. And so this whole story is supposedly making up kind of the background to that. And it says about Haran that he said when Nimrod was going to punish Avram, look, if Avram survives this, then I'll know that Hashem is king and I'll follow Hashem and Avram. And if Avram is burned up, then I'll know that Nimrod is king and I'll follow Nimrod. And then Avram is saved. We know that part. He's miraculously saved from the fire. So then Haran says, okay, so I'm going to follow Avram and Hashem. And Nimrod, of course, then takes Haran and says, well, then you should also be punished for this, and throws him in the fire, and he's burned to death, right? And so it's a not so happy ending to the story, or maybe, depending on how you look at it, but it's certainly a grisly ending to the story. But in any case, uh, it is drawing our attention to actually, I think, quite a fundamental point about how we should think about the interaction between Hashem's role in the world and the expression of his will in the world on the one hand, and how we are expected to reason about the natural course of events in the world. And really, that's all in the backstory of this midrash, right? Because this whole disputation about water, quenching fire, and the clouds holding the water, it's talking about how the world is made up of different things that have regular and reproducible behaviors, and that the world in some sense is governed by natural laws. And if that's so, then who or what in the world is worthy of our devotion, right? Which power, which force, which law is somehow king? And the Midrash is trying to show that none of the laws or none of the powers in the world are king. And then it must be the lawmaker who stands above them, who is the real one who deserves our devotion, which is Avram's message to the world, right? But there's a bit of a challenge there, because on the one hand, we're being asked to take notice of the fact that really the world kind of has laws of nature, and those are discernible. We can learn things about how the world works by observing and reasoning and putting things together, and that's kind of the beginning of scientific thinking and all the things that you can discover that way. But then we also put Hashem above all of that, and we say, oh, well, but whenever he wants, he obviously can have something happen that doesn't seem to you to be what a scientific or naturalistic understanding of the world would predict. For example, if you take a person and throw them in a fiery furnace, you expect them to be burnt to a crisp, which is what happens to Haran, but it is not what happens to Avram. And that's the point of this this miracle that happens for Avram, that there's an unexpected event. And it's an unexpected event that expresses HaKadosh Baruch Hu's desire to judge Avram differently than his peers, and have something therefore happen to him that you couldn't necessarily predict from what's natural or what's normal. And I think that while it's true, on the one hand, that there's a whole lot in serving Hashem and keeping the Torah and studying the Torah, where you don't have to concern yourself with miracles or nisim, to use a more correct term. These are not things that are supposed to be happening to you all the time, and they're not things you're supposed to be relying on. So in some sense, you could say, most of life doesn't require you to really concern yourself with exactly what a ness is and how it can happen. And that does allow, I think, a lot of people in their avodat Hashem to be, if they want to, very rooted in a scientific understanding of the world. And there's a lot that's practically beneficial about that, and really good science can be used to make you successful in keeping the Torah and serving Hashem and all of that. However, there is a whole lot of discussion of or description of events going on in Tanakh, and then also going on into the Talmud and everything we have from our sages, where the whole point clearly is to tell you about something that happened that seemed unnatural, not normal, not expected. And to the degree that that's the case, we do have to deal with that somehow. We have to confront the question of, how does that work exactly? Is it that we're not in full possession of all the information we need to make the right naturalistic prediction? Or is it that our model of the natural world is wrong, but if it were right, we'd be able to explain the thing we don't expect? Or is it that HaKadosh Baruch Hu, whenever he wants to, can press pause on the laws of nature and just write the story a different way if he wishes? And then, we take notice of that, and then things revert back to, there are all these different kinds of constructs you can put on that. But the question is, which is it? What are we dealing with? And I don't think it's easy to give a full answer to that question in brief, but I do think this midrash is making quite a subtle point about this question, particularly with the way it finishes by talking about Haran, this brother of Avram who ends up getting burned up. Because at a surface level, I think there's a way to understand that part of the story that I think children get quite readily, which is that it's teaching you something about true emunah, true faith or trust in Hashem, right? Avram trusted in Hashem in that he knew Hashem was king, and he was so devoted to bringing that message to humanity that he was willing to, without any sort of clear promise or understanding of how this was supposed to work to his benefit, he was willing to stand for that message, even when it put him in a very dangerous situation, right? And to stand before a God king and argue to him that he is not a God, and to argue instead for the name of Hashem. And then with that sincerity and without implicitly the expectation of magical power that somehow should derive from insisting on that message, Avram is saved miraculously. And then we turn to the case of Haran, and Haran is the opposite, right? He's trying to make a science out of using faith as a path to power, because he's saying basically, I just want to see empirical evidence of who's more powerful, Nimrod or Hashem. I want to basically make a science out of showing that Hashem is the most powerful. And if he is, which I'm open to the possibility that he's not, but if he is, if my experiments prove correct, then I'll follow Hashem. And the moment that you're thinking in those terms, it doesn't work, right? And this is what Chazal in this Midrash are trying to show us. They're saying you can't beat the system in a sense that HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows the truth of what's in your heart. And if you are taking risks without thinking about his miraculous help, because you feel compelled to out of loyalty to him, then miraculous help is freely available, it would seem. But if instead you are thinking and rationally calculating about how miraculous help is supposed to help you win the day, and in a sense, even worse than that, you're choosing whom to be loyal to on the basis of how much power they have to help you, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not interested in that kind of loyalty, right? He's not trying to buy your loyalty with his power. And if you try to bring about that transaction, he will step back from the scene and let you contend with nature. That, I think, is the relatively basic point, and one that I think, even as a child, hearing that part of the Midrash, you can kind of get that, okay, yeah, Hashem wants people who really trust in him, who really are committed to him and loyal to him for the right reasons, and not people who are cynically trying to guess or calculate whether it's really worth it for them to trust in Hashem and follow him. But there's an additional level of this that I think we also have to engage with, which is, how do we fit this into our understanding of what science is and what it's telling us about the world and how it works? Because on the one hand, logically, it does seem like there isn't any problem per se with making the following claim about the world. Whenever there is, either insincerity or people who are trying to just kind of be empirical and view the world as a natural mechanism, or whenever they're trying to kind of scientifically test God's power, all the kind of dispassionate or insincere observation of what happens in the world that tries to build an objective theory of how it always works, that when you look at things that way, Hashem is going to just let the world behave naturally. However, when instead there's the right kind of kavanah, the right kind of intention, the right kind of sincerity, something different can happen. And the reason that that's a significant, uh, let's say, logical loophole for our purposes right now is that it automatically means that you can't scientifically prove that this isn't how the world works. Why is that? Because we've invented an account of the world in explicating this midrash that by definition skirts that whole issue, because it says, so to speak, when you turn your scientific lens towards something, when you're looking at things in those terms, when you're asking what's reproducible, what's reliable, what's natural, what always works the same way, that's when the world works according to what you call natural laws. And so only in the moments where no one is doing that, where no one is kind of deliberately trying to set Hakadosh Baruch Hu up so his hand is forced and he has to show that he's really stacking the deck wherever he wants or writing the story whatever way he wants. That in such moments where someone's trying to force his hand, he's definitely not going to show it, but only where none of that is going on and where there's someone who kind of deserves it and has some pure intention and merits it and all of that. That's when these things can happen. And if you set things up that way, then someone could come along and say, oh well, I don't think that nisim can happen because my scientific examination of how the world works has never shown me any evidence that they can. And you can just say, well, yeah, but that's because the whole package deal of how these things work together is that all of that just poof is invisible, has nothing to do with what's going on in the world the moment you turn that kind of scrutiny to the world. And so it's a logically perfect kind of philosophical game you can play where you can say there are things that can happen, but they're invisible to science by definition, because they're only allowed to happen when that kind of test is not being applied. And so we can be happy with science working when people try to do science, and we also can be happy with the world not being bound by what science not just currently says about how the world works, but could ever say about how the world works, or could ever, reveal to us about natural mechanisms or whatever. And I think if you put that forward to an intellectually honest scientist, they very well might say that there's something logically consistent about that, but they would also maybe find it kind of laughable because they would say, well, but what is the point of believing something like that, right? Like it's a sort of I don't know if they would exactly introduce the idea of Occam's razor, but I think some would be tempted to in that case, where they'd be saying, look, this is a theory that has no additional explanatory power about the world, and all you're doing is you're saying, I think something is happening a certain way when I look at it, but if I'm not looking at it and I'm not scrutinizing it, then it can happen another way, but I will never get any evidence that it does happen that other way. And so what's the point of claiming that about the world? It seems to, at first, not be a theory of things that has any additional consequences. And so it's kind of just a logically perfect game that you can make up where you tell yourself something is true that science can't falsify, but it's also something that it seems sort of at first invisible or not with substantive consequences in the world. But I think there is a mistake in that argument, which is where we're going to get to. But that's something that we should be aware of as kind of like, well, what is the typical intellectual counterattack if someone starts talking this way, where it's like, oh well, yeah, of course, you can't see the magical thing unless you are willing to stop testing whether it's there. And so only people who are not interested in the enterprise of testing things can actually see this. And that's a great way of explaining a lot of sort of cultic shared delusions, and making them seem logically impervious to scrutiny. But they also seem perhaps not to have any, additional predictive or explanatory power. So then the question is, what are they for? And why bother with a fantasy of that kind? I think that's the kind of question you could maybe imagine a sort of scientific or scientistic critic asking. And it's connected with a lot of other kinds of arguments they make, where it's like, whatever evidence we see in the world that disagrees with some account we want to give of the world, according to things that we are committed to believing, we just say, oh, that evidence was just put there by Hashem to test our faith, and it can be ignored, therefore, right? There are sort of pat and overly simple kinds of rhetoric like that, where you just say, oh, yeah, of course I care about evidence. Only the evidence that agrees with what I'm saying, and any evidence that disagrees with it was a miraculous sort of test orchestrated by the hand of the divine. And so I can ignore it. And that means that really you don't reason from evidence, right? You just believe something and sort of paint over the perhaps greater or at least equal amount of evidence that disagrees with whatever it is you think. So we're hearing out those kinds of arguments. And now I think I want to do two things talking about this midrash, one of which is more kind of a matter of analysis and interpretation of it in connection with other texts, which we'll get into for a second. The first is just to close up the point about talking about, we have to ask ourselves, what can it mean for someone to say there is the possibility of occurrences happening in the world, or the way the universe works is that something that you would call miraculous or a nes, or however you want to term it, that kind of thing can happen, but it only happens in a way that by definition cannot be subject to scientific scrutiny, because the moment you try to scrutinize it in that way, that then HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't want to jump when you say jump, and so he's not going to do anything that would count in your book as some kind of miraculous occurrence. So if that's the claim, and this is what we are getting from this midrash about the brother of Avram dying because he didn't have the same faith that Avram had, and so when he was thrown in the furnace, he gets burned up, whereas Avram wasn't. If we're thinking in those terms, I think that there is another way. Like, we don't have to simply say, oh, this is all very well and good, but it's a logically perfect kind of protective envelope for a fantasy that has no predictive power or explanatory power, and it's just a game people play, to excuse all the evidence, or to excuse ignoring all the evidence that they don't want to face, or something like that. I think there's a different way forward here, and that is to say the following: what the perspective on explaining the events of the world from a scientific standpoint is going to miss is that it is not the case that just because you can't give what you might call an objective scientific explanation of something, that therefore it has no kind of explanation, or that just because something isn't an objective and scientizable truth, that it can't be any other kind of truth. And I think scientists or the scientific community often kind of get away with having this branding where everyone implicitly kind of accepts that must be true, that if something is going to be true, then it must be somehow the case that there is a way for science to agree with it. And scientists, I think, actually usually don't think much about this, and think also that must be the case. But there is a set of things that you could say do count in the ledger of things that happen in the world, on the basis of which someone could, let's say, make observations that show them things about whether something is happening according to what you would call natural laws or not, but where it's not a scientizable question, it's not something that we can call objective. And that is if we talk about subjective experience. What science does as a methodology is it starts out with the ideal of, let's just talk about what seems the same to everyone, right? Scientists always publish their materials and methods when they do experiments because other people need to reproduce the results that you get. They need to be able to show the same thing happens in their hands as happens in your hands. So you say, okay, I added this chemical to that one, and then I heated it, and then I subjected it to, some kind of electrical voltage, and that produced, a color change, et cetera, right? Unless someone else gets that same result, what does it mean for you to claim that that happened, right? That isn't science. Science doesn't work with, oh, well, I can make this happen, or only this happened to me, but I don't expect it to happen to you. That by definition isn't science. But that doesn't mean it can't, by definition, be part of something that you could call a kind of truth, right? Because there are things, actually most things at some level, that are part of subjective experience. And there is, to some degree, an ability that we have to judge what happened and what didn't that doesn't necessarily have to be part of, the availability, the information that's available to everyone. And so you can't make a science out of it, but you can develop relationship with Hashem through it, and you can fit into that space the possibility of things happening that seem unnatural or that seem unexpected. So I think the point is that when we're talking about the difference between Avram and Haran, the key point is that this is about intention, which is ultimately, or certainly can be, a very subjective thing, right? I can have certain intentions. I can say things to myself that no one else knows or hears, and you can do the same. And when Avram and Haran perhaps do that, Hashem knows which one of them has which kind of interest in calling for, support of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And so he knows that Avram is doing it for the right reasons and Haran is doing it for the wrong reasons, and he can judge between them. And that difference in perspective of the individual experiencing the events is something that Chazal are using as a device in this midrash, because they're saying, look, whether in many cases in your life you're doing something because you actually have some kind of sincere desire to serve Hashem properly without expecting anything in return, or whether you're operating more in this posture of, boy, I really don't particularly want to do this, but I'm going to do it because I think it has the magical power granted by Hashem to give me some kind of blessing that I'm going to get in return. And so, you if you examine your own intentions, can understand a lot about which way you're actually thinking. And it's not always totally clear to us, and sometimes it requires that self-examination. But to the degree that that's the case, if then we know something that's a fact that's available to us about our intentions, and we're at the same time seeing what happens in the world, and also it's the case that what we see happens in the world is partly still just our subjective experience, where it's not all information that's available to everyone, then suddenly a huge space opens up for there to be, I wouldn't say a science, but let's say the possibility of a subjective experience over time of going, one foot in front of the other through the world and being able to see a relationship between your intentions and what HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives back to you. And when something comes back to you that seems to you to be totally unexpected or even supernatural as far as you can tell, and that can happen in a world where whenever the big group of objective scientists are turned their lens of objectivity on things, none of those interesting, seemingly supernatural things are going to happen, right? And so I think that the deeper point made in this midrash is that it's not just saying, oh, look, HaKadosh Baruch Hu judges Avram's intentions to be good and Haran's to be bad, and that divides between them. But it's also trying to situate this in the broader context of saying, look, yes, the world seems to behave according to natural laws. So what exactly, how exactly does that fit together with or jibe with the idea that Hashem intervenes in the world, or that he, chooses for things to happen in the world that don't necessarily always seem to the observer to comport with those natural laws? And the key point here is that it's about the difference between the ideal of objectivity and what can reproducibly be shown to be part of the way the world always seems to work when all the scientists get together and share their methods and show, yeah, when you perform this procedure, you get this result. And here's how you can, turn hydrogen and oxygen into water or whatever else your kind of transformation you're trying to bring about. But that when that kind of scrutiny is not being turned on things, that leaves a lot of room for it to both be the case that the world and the universe usually seems to operate according to our expectation from what we would call the natural or the normal or the typical behavior. But it still can be possible that from the perspective of a subjective observer, and perhaps in some kind of conjunction with that subjective observer's intention and what kind of relationship he or she is seeking with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and how that is based on study of Torah and trying to do the right thing according to how he's taught us to do the right thing, that those things can produce the possibility of experience of whatever you want to call it, a nes, a miracle, the seemingly supernatural, or just the wholly unexpected. And there isn't any, it's both the case that it, by definition, is beyond the realm of any kind of scientific scrutiny or inquiry. And it's also the case that it isn't just kind of an empty rhetorical balloon of circular logic into which you can put a fantasy that has no consequences, because the events of your subjective experience are real consequences, and they can write the story of your life in a way that has meaning to you, and can become the basis for a deepening relationship with the creator and king of the world.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.